Patriotism is not enough. From Edith Cavell, Her Life Story by Herbert Leeds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The reign of terror, begun with the first entry of the Germans into Brussels, appears to have increased considerably in later months. More and more repressive measures came to be put in force at the instigation of General von Bissing. Miss Cavell was one of several persons to fall under suspicion of hiding British and French soldiers at her house, and of helping them and young Belgians of military age to cross the frontier. On August 5th she was arrested, but the American legation in Brussels did not come to hear of it until August 31st. The American minister, Mr. Brand Whitlock, wrote at once to Baron von der Lancken, requesting particulars and permission to see Miss Cavell in order to arrange for her defence. No reply was received, and a second application was made on September 10th, to which Baron von der Lancken replied on September 12th, stating that Miss Cavell had admitted the charge, and that her defence was in the hands of a Mr. Brown. Mr. Whitlock had asked permission for Monsieur de Laval, the legal counsellor to the American legation, to confer with Miss Cavell respecting her defence, but this was refused. It is clear from a letter sent by Mr. Brand Whitlock to the American ambassador in London that even at this stage Miss Cavell had admitted having hidden in her house English and French soldiers, and had facilitated the departure of Belgian soldiers for the front, furnishing them with money and guides to pass the frontier. She never appears to have sought to evade the allegation of her accusers. She probably knew as well as anyone that her action was against the German military law. She may also be allowed to have shrewdly guessed what the penalty would be were she once arrested. Respect for womanhood had long since been shown to form no part of the religion of valour preached by Bernhardi, and completely embodied in German military ethics. It is to do less than justice to her patriotism, intelligence, and noble courage to suppose that she did not take into account all the terrible possibilities that hung on her endeavour to protect and help anyone belonging to our Allied forces. Saving the lives of others had been the purpose to which she had dedicated her life, and the concealing and smuggling away of hunted soldiers who stood in jeopardy was probably, in her view, as humanitarian an action as tending the wounded. And to do this she was prepared to calmly face the worst consequences, as her last hours prove. Refusal having been made to the application for permission for Monsieur de Laval to confer with Miss Cavell as to her defence, Monsieur de Laval had an interview with Mr. Brown, who stated that as unforeseen circumstances prevented his taking up the case, he had asked Mr. Kirschen, a member of the Brussels bar, to plead for Miss Cavell. Asked whether he had seen Miss Cavell, and whether she had made any statement to him, Mr. Kirschen said that lawyers defending prisoners before the German military court were not allowed to see their clients before the trial, and were not shown any document of the prosecution. He added that the hearing of the trial of such cases was carried out very carefully, and that in his opinion, although it was not possible to see the client before the trial, in fact the trial itself developed so carefully and so slowly that it was generally possible to have a fair knowledge of all the facts, and to present a good defence for the prisoner. This, he went on to say, would specially be the case for Miss Cavell, because the trial would be rather long, as she was prosecuted with 34 other prisoners. Informed that Monsieur de Laval intended to watch the case, he dissuaded him on the ground that such an attitude would cause a great prejudice to the prisoner, as the German judges would resent it, and feel it almost as an affront. Mr. Kirschen, who, though a naturalized Belgian subject, is said to be of Austrian origin, was at great pains to assure that the Brussels military court was always perfectly fair, and that there was not the slightest danger of any miscarriage of justice. He promised to keep the American legation posted as to all developments the case might take, and to state the result of the trial. He further declared that he would do all that was humanly possible to defend Miss Cavell. From this point, events became veiled with a strange secrecy. It is true that 3 days before the date fixed for the trial, Thursday, October 7th, Mr. Kirschen wrote briefly informing the American legation of this fact. The trial began on the date stated and lasted for 2 days. But no information concerning it reached the American legation from Mr. Kirschen. All the legation came to hear of the case was conveyed by an outsider on the Saturday. The legation was given to understand that though the trial was completed, judgment would not be given till a few days later. Efforts were made by the legation staff to find Mr. Kirschen, but without success. The legation was left to shift for itself in gleaning any information respecting the course of the trial. On Saturday, October 10th, M. de Laval learned from a person present at the proceedings that Miss Cavell, in her statement, provided almost all the facts of the prosecution. This informant stated, Miss Cavell was prosecuted for having helped English and French soldiers as well as Belgian young men to cross the frontier and to go over to England. She had admitted by signing a statement before the day of the trial and by public acknowledgment in court, in the presence of all the other prisoners and the lawyers, that she was guilty of the charges brought against her, and she had acknowledged not only that she had helped these soldiers to cross the frontier, but also that some of them had thanked her in writing when arriving in England. This last admission made her case so much the more serious, because if it only had been proved against her that she had helped the soldiers to traverse the Dutch frontier, and no proof was produced that those soldiers had reached a country at war with Germany, she could only have been sentenced for an attempt to commit the crime, and not for the crime being duly accomplished. As the case stood, the sentence fixed by the German military law was a sentence of death. In her oral statement before the court, Miss Cavell disclosed almost all the facts of the whole prosecution. She was questioned in German, an interpreter translating all the questions in French, with which language Miss Cavell was well acquainted. She spoke without trembling, and showed a clear mind. Often she added some greater precision to her previous depositions. When she was asked why she helped these soldiers to go to England, she replied that she thought that if she had not done so, they would have been shot by the Germans, and that therefore she thought she only did her duty to her country in saving their lives. On the same Sunday evening and on Monday, M. de Laval made repeated endeavours to get permission to see Miss Cavell, but without avail. Assurances were, however, given by Mr. Conrad, of the political division of the German government in Belgium, that he would not fail to inform the American legation as soon as there was any news. The atmosphere of mystery began to thicken rapidly. At 8:30 on that Monday evening, the legation suddenly learned that sentence had been passed on Miss Cavell in the course of the afternoon, and that her execution would take place at 2 o'clock next morning. Even this announcement, like the account of the trial, came to them from an outside source. The American minister being at the time ill in bed, Mr. Hugh Gibson, secretary to the American legation, proceeded, in accordance with the minister's instructions, to look for the Spanish minister. Mr. Gibson was accompanied by M. de Laval, and after finding the Spanish minister, all three called on Baron von der Lancken to plead in the name of the legation that execution of the death penalty should be deferred until the governor could consider the appeal for clemency. The simple story of that momentous interview, as told by Mr. Gibson in the report to his sick chief, takes a place side by side with the supremely touching record furnished by the English chaplain of his final conversation with Miss Cavell. "So far as I am able to judge," wrote Mr. Gibson, "we neglected to present no phase of the matter which might have had any effect, emphasizing the horror of executing a woman, no matter what her offence, pointing out that the death sentence had heretofore been imposed only for actual cases of espionage, and that Miss Cavell was not even accused by the German authorities of anything so serious. I further called attention to the failure to comply with Mr. Conrad's promise to inform the legation of the sentence. I urged that, inasmuch as the offences charged against Miss Cavell were long since accomplished, and that as she had been for some weeks in prison, a delay in carrying out the sentence could entail no danger to the German cause. I even went so far as to point out the fearful effect of a summary execution of this sort upon public opinion, both here and abroad, and although I had no authority for doing so, called attention to the possibility that it might bring about reprisals. The Spanish minister forcibly supported all our representations and made an earnest plea for clemency. Baron von der Lancken stated that the military governor was the supreme authority, Gerichtsheer, in matters of this sort, that appeal from his decision could be carried only to the emperor, the governor-general having no authority to intervene in such cases. He added that under the provisions of German martial law, the military governor had discretionary powers to accept or to refuse acceptance of an appeal for clemency. After some discussion, he agreed to call the military governor on the telephone. He returned in about half an hour, and stated that he had been to confer personally with the military governor, who said that he had acted in the case of Miss Cavell only after mature deliberation, that the circumstances in her case were of such a character that he considered the infliction of the death penalty imperative, and that in view of the circumstances of this case he must decline to accept your plea for clemency or any representation in regard to the matter. Baron von der Lancken then asked me to take back the note which I had presented to him. To this I demurred, pointing out that it was not a requête en grâce, but merely a note to him transmitting a communication to the governor, which was itself to be considered as the requête en grâce. I pointed out that this was expressly stated in your note to him, and tried to prevail upon him to keep it. He was very insistent, however, and I finally reached the conclusion that inasmuch as he had read it aloud to us, and we knew that he was aware of its contents, there was nothing to be gained by refusing to accept the note, and accordingly took it back. Even after Baron von der Lancken's very positive and definite statement that there was no hope, and that under the circumstances even the Emperor himself could not intervene, we continued to appeal to every sentiment to secure delay. And the Spanish minister even led Baron von der Lancken aside in order to say very forcibly a number of things which he would have felt hesitancy in saying in the presence of the younger officers and of Monsieur de Laval, a Belgian subject. His Excellency talked very earnestly with Baron von der Lancken for about a quarter of an hour. During this time, Monsieur de Laval and I presented to the younger officers every argument we could think of. I reminded them of our untiring efforts on behalf of German subjects at the outbreak of the war and during the siege of Antwerp. I pointed out that while our services had been rendered gladly and without any thought of future favours, they should certainly entitle you to some consideration for the only request of this sort you had made since the beginning of the war. Unfortunately, our efforts were unavailing. We persevered until it was only too clear that there was no hope of securing any consideration for the case. We left the politische Abteilung shortly after midnight. While this chivalrous fight of diplomacy was being put forth on Miss Cavell's behalf, Mr. Gowan, the British chaplain, was saying his last goodbye to this noble woman in the condemned cell. On Monday evening, October 11th, I was admitted, wrote Mr. Gowan, by special passport from the German authorities to the prison of Saint-Gilles, where Miss Edith Cavell had been confined for 10 weeks. The final sentence had been given early that afternoon. To my astonishment and relief, I found my friend perfectly calm and resigned. But this could not lessen the tenderness and intensity of feeling on either part during that last interview of almost an hour. Her first words to me were upon a matter concerning herself personally, but the solemn asseveration which accompanied them was made expressly in the light of God and eternity. She then added that she wished all her friends to know that she willingly gave her life for her country, and said, "I have no fear nor shrinking. I have seen death so often that it is not strange or fearful to me." She further said, "I thank God for this 10 weeks' quiet before the end. Life has always been hurried and full of difficulty. This time of rest has been a great mercy. They've all been very kind to me here. But this I would say, standing as I do in view of God and eternity, I realize that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone. We partook of the Holy Communion together, and she received the gospel message of consolation with all her heart. At the close of the little service, I began to repeat the words, "Abide with me," and she joined softly in the end. We sat quietly talking until it was time for me to go. She gave me parting messages for relations and friends. She spoke of her soul's needs at the moment, and she received the assurance of God's word as only the Christian can do. Then I said, "Goodbye," and she smiled and said, "We shall meet again." A little later, Edith Cavell, Christian and heroine, lay dead in the cold courtyard of the prison of Saint-Gilles. End of Patriotism is Not Enough, from Edith Cavell, Her Life Story, by Herbert, Leeds. Read by Patrick Wallace.